All of these likely tendencies, we said, would leave the structural legacy of apartheid colonialism and the socio-economic crisis affecting the majority of South Africans largely intact. In other words, unless we begin to do something else, the gains we've made over the past 23 years are under threat. Now, it's correct to say in 2017, these observations of ours have been proven correct. Does this mean that the strategic concept of an NDR is itself inherently flawed? Are national liberation movements inherently bourgeois democratic in nature? Worse still, once in power, after two decades or so, are national liberation movements bound to degenerate? Is the current fragmentation of our own liberation movement inevitable and therefore irreversible? These have long been the arguments, by the way, of an anti-ANC and anti-SACP left, as well as of liberal forces who regard the national question as irrelevant. These are very important questions for the Communist Party. They're not just theoretical, they are practical, programmatic, and strategic questions that needs to be answered. To help answer these questions, one important step is to try very quickly to revisit the historical roots of our strategic perspective of a radical NDR. So that we understand where we are and even possibly why we were where we are. Sifike kanjani? Mongameli Makwai, sifike kanjani la sikhona? Maybe nehawe in answer. Now, a brief revisiting of the history behind the concept of an NDR is all the more relevant in this year of 2017, which is the centenary year of the Bolshevik October 1917 revolution. Perhaps the greatest and most enduring legacy of the Bolshevik revolution on the South African struggle relates to the national question. Moreover, this 14th Party Congress will elect a central committee that will take the SACP to the centenary of our party in 2021. It is therefore appropriate that we use the occasion of this 14th Congress to begin to reflect once more on the long road we've taken, building on a proud Bolshevik legacy. In brief, at the Second Congress of the Communist International in 1920, there was a commission on the national and the colonial question, in which Lenin and the Indian communist M.N. Roy played leading roles. In his report back to Congress on the Commission's work, Lenin wrote, and I quote, "We have discussed whether it would be right or wrong, in principle and in theory, to state that the Communist International and the Communist parties must support the bourgeois democratic movement in backward countries. As a result of our discussion, we have arrived at a unanimous decision to speak of the national revolutionary movement rather than of the bourgeois democratic movement." Comrade Sidi Mfamati, uyayizwa lento engishoyo. Uyareporta uLenin from a commission a Congress, a Comintern, that maybe we should not characterize these national movements in developing countries as bourgeois democratic. Maybe actually they are national revolutionary movements. Why? But you can see from here where the origins of this idea of a national democratic revolution comes from. Then Lenin, as I say why, Lenin goes on to explain that the idea of a national revolutionary movement was advanced to distinguish between two diverging tendencies within national liberation struggles. The one national revolutionary the other a bourgeois democratic reformist tendency. Which he then continues to say, quote, "If we speak of the bourgeois democratic movement, we shall be obliterating all distinctions between the reformist and the revolutionary movement. Yet that distinction has been very clearly revealed of late in the backward and colonial countries. It was for this reason that the Comintern urged communist parties in countries like India and China to work closely with and help to radicalize the national democratic tendency in the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle." When the SACP, as the CPSA then, the Communist Party of South Africa, was formed in July 1921, same time as the Communist Party of China, the socio-economic context was different in South Africa to that prevailing in India and China. Because India and China had overwhelmingly peasant majority populations. At that point, for nearly half a century, much of the Southern African region had already been plunged into a massive process of monopoly capitalist-driven transformation. Rapid industrialization centered on the diamond fields around Kimberley, and then gold fields in the Witwatersrand. These drew huge inflows of private monopoly capital from the imperialist centers. There were major investments in mines and also in rail and port infrastructure connecting the mining hinterland to the colonial ports, which, by the way, is the legacy that colonialism left us with. I don't know what is these positive aspects of colonialism we must be speaking about. They left us with a disconnected African continent that has no transport connections within itself, but connects to the sea in order to take our mineral resources away to Europe and North America. The Anglo-Boer War, or the South African War, the largest armed conflict of its time, forcibly consolidated disparate states, establishing the Union of South Africa in 1910. Above all, this massive capitalist-driven industrial revolution transformed the hard-pressed African peasantry and traditional African societies, impoverishing them, but most importantly, it produced the working class, which was a very distinct feature of a developing country like South Africa. Our own early Communist Party right from the word go, waged the struggle against mining monopoly capital. We don't like this thing of being lectured about monopoly capital by people we don't know, who were not even here when we were fighting against the brutal colonial apartheid regime. Since 1921, the SACP's struggle has been against monopoly capital of one form or the other. See, discovering a monopoly capital only today. And we don't know this notion of white monopoly capital. That we might have flattered it with it does not justify that some Bell Pottinger firm from the UK has now used this as a cliche to try and justify looting in our country. Where my delegates, let's not sloganeer around these things. Let's put content into them, using this Congress and beyond. Now, to summarize a long story that is here, in 1929, the South African Communist Party adopted a resolution that had been proposed by the Communist International. In essence, saying to South African communists, your struggle for socialism is integrally linked with the struggle to fight against the national oppression of the majority. They are not separate struggles. You must fight it together. You also go and work with emergent nationalist organizations. That's when this alliance of ours actually starts. In 1929, initiated by the South African Communist Party, which also, by the way, puts a burden on us as the party about the future of this alliance. But there have always been two tendencies in the liberation movements. Always. Much of the first half of the 20th century, the ANC, for instance, held a broadly progressive but essentially liberal reformist perspective of the nature of the national struggle. Ingako leya ANC yakudala used to send delegations to England and all that to try and argue our case. It was not until the struggles of the working class of the 1940s also had an impact in radicalizing the ANC itself, starting with the adoption of the program of action of the ANC Youth League. And the ANC increasingly moved towards a more radical approach and also embraced the Freedom Charter, which was actually adopted by the Congress of the People in 1955. We must also remember there have always been in the ANC a tension between more narrowly nationalist and more bourgeois reformist tendencies on the one hand, and more progressive left-leaning tendencies on the other. In 1962, the SACP, in its program, The Road to South African Freedom, reaffirmed the revolutionary national democratic nature of the South African struggle. And the SACP in 1962 introduced the important concept of colonialism of a special type to refer to the South African situation. Now here that then things also become more important. The crucial ANC 1969 Morogoro Conference, which marked a critical turning point after the major strategic defeat suffered by our movement in the mid-1960s, in effect reaffirms Lenin's distinction between a bourgeois democratic revolution and national revolutionary movements. Its strategy and tactics ka 69, I quote, "Our nationalism, kusho ANC, must not be confused with chauvinism or narrow nationalism of a previous epoch. It must not be confused with the classical drive by an elitist group among the oppressed to gain ascendancy so that they can replace the oppressor in the exploitation of the mass," unquote. We never fought the struggle to liberate this country in order to hand over our economy to a family known as the Guptas and call that liberation. Actually, it's an affront. It's a very serious affront to our movement. Just as, by the way, Morogoro also emphasized that ours was not to hand over power from a black elite, from a white elite, to a black elite. That's why we also find this concept of white monopoly capital quite strange, because it's as if we have got black monopoly capital, then South Africa will be liberated. Now, I'm trying to move a little bit quicker. My fellow secretariat will excuse me for jumping here and there because we had and the Central Committee. Let me quote Morogoro for the last time. "We do not underestimate the complexities which will face a people's government during the transformation period, nor the enormity of the problems of meeting the economic needs of the mass of the oppressed people. But one thing is certain, in our land, this cannot be effectively tackled unless the basic wealth and the basic resources are at the disposal of the people as a whole and are not manipulated by sections of individuals, be they white or black. In short, Morogoro, while recognizing likely difficulties, did not see these as reasons to abandon the strategy of a radical national democratic revolution. Now, a bit about the 1994 democratic breakthrough, because we are trying to say, where are we coming from, and therefore, how do we understand the current challenges? There was a debate, by the way, immediately after April 1994 in our movement about the meaning of 1994. Our message as the SACP's Central Committee, we said the struggle continues. By the way, there was a debate even inside the party because Comrade Joslov was a little bit irritated. Why are we having an African communist with a big thing outside saying, "A luta continua"? Hasn't things changed? But also inside the movement, there were those who were saying, "Free at last." With Maibuya's cover, for instance, with the union buildings. Optimism, of course, important. But buried beneath this was the meaning, debate about the meaning of 1994. Now, the first post-apartheid decade and a half, since 1994, which we see as the first phase of our NDR, we argued that this phase was constituted by the radical breakthrough in the 1994 to 1996 period, which saw the abolition of institutions of white minority rule and a progressive institution, as I have said, put in place. And we had said the second phase should have started immediately. And we argued that the landslide 1994 ANC electoral victory, the unextinguished popular and working class struggle traditions at the time that had made negotiated transition possible in the first place, and the fact that South Africa based private monopoly capital, given its deep complicity with white minority rule, was off balance. That was our view. Good. With 1994 victory, they were off balance. And therefore, we needed to move with speed on the front of economic transformation. We then were guided by our slogan we adopted in 1995, "Socialism is the future, build it now," because we saw the taking forward of the national democratic revolution with strong socialist type measures, not pursuing socialism by the ANC, as others used to say to us, but to say, for us as the SACP, we need strong socialist type measures if we are to drive economic transformation, for instance. Unfortunately, it was not to be, because we also had another debate after 1996, especially after the adoption of GEAR as the economic policy. We felt that as South Africa, we were more or less modeling ourselves around a kind of a third way, as was pursued at the time by your Tony Blairs, your Bill Clintons. In fact, we regard Obama as the last of your third way leaders in the West. Big debates inside the alliance around where we actually need to go. But at least there were debates. At least there were debates. Not these attempts now to shut debates down in order to impose particular views and issues. Now, deindustrialization, growing employment precariousness, deepening inequality, and the flow of migrants has been the terrain on which populist, rhetorically anti-establishment right and extreme right-wing political parties and personalities have surged electorally within the US. Global capitalism is in a crisis, especially its neoliberal model, which is leading to the emergence of these populist figures. Who thought that the United States could both elect an Obama and immediately after that a Donald Trump? That was the background, comrades, on the NDR and some of the challenges we've faced. But we want to move closer to the current period. How did we get where we are now? Let's briefly touch on the Polokwane moment. After 1994, there were consistent efforts from within the ANC and ANC-led movement to counter this, which we call the neoliberal third way project, which we had termed the 1996 class project. These efforts came to a head in Polokwane, and one of the organizing perspectives of the upheaval that occurred at this point was the assertion that the ANC is the strategic political center. Sike saba nempi enkulu la. Who is the strategic political center? Is it the ANC or the alliance? At face value and for many, these assertions of the strategic primacy of the ANC-led movement represented an attempt to reassert the democratic and mass-based movement character of the ANC. However, if truth be told, let's go back and look at Polokwane soberly. Not with, what is this colored, what? Rose-colored glasses. In practice, the Polokwane moment involved a marriage of convenience, or perhaps an unholy alliance, of the broad left anti-neoliberal bloc with demagogic forces for whom the assertion of the ANC as the strategic political center was a move to displace incumbents in the state with their own, in order to advance an even more aggressive, parasitic, rent-seeking agenda. These latter forces identified patronage-based mobilization within the ANC as the soft underbelly from which to capture strategic positions within the state. But some of them are gone now, in the form of the EFF. Oh, Madima, they were not fighting with us because we shared the same broad economic or political perspective. They wanted to replace those who were in power so that they themselves can come in and eat. So Polokwane came to pass. And then there was the first Zuma-led ANC administration. We're coming closer to these issues. In the first Zuma-led administration between 2009 and 2014, there was a relative balance of forces between the divergent agendas that had come together in a marriage of convenience at Polokwane. In some sectors, health with a major shift on AIDS, trade and industrial policy, state-led infrastructure spend, recalibrating competition policy as a means to leverage economic transformation, a greater emphasis on vocational training. Space was opened up for progressive advances, including developing a better working relationship between the state and social movements. By the way, we must not be misunderstood. There are many sane comrades in the African National Congress. Ama-comrades at angawona makomanis kodwa who have an interest of our people at heart. We must not be misinterpreted. as if there are no such people in the African National Congress. Many of whom, by the way, who are fed up about these parasitic patronage networks. However, in terms of sustaining and rebuilding the ANC-led movement's capacity to mobilize, the key motive forces, these and other positives in state development, coincided with the weakening of COSATU, unfortunately, partly as a result of the global economic downturn and resultant retrenchments. Also on the side of the SACP, there was a loss of momentum in terms of active working class and popular mobilization, a failure to sustain very successful financial sector campaign for instance. Deployment advances in some sectors noted above, however, were always and surely deliberately held in check by other deployments in the 2009-2014 administration. A related question that this Congress must... communists, by the way, have always been in government since 1994. This idea that it's this current leadership that is in government, as if before there was no Joe Slovo, there were no Jeff Katebes, there were no many other communists who were serving. Here is Kumalo there, Ronnie Casrills, who was in our Politburo and served as a minister. But at the same time, we need to ask the question, has the deployment since 2009 tended to strengthen or weaken the party, deployment into government? We must be frank about that, which is what also this document is trying to pose this question. Now, we need to discuss this at this Congress. We know there are many communists who are serving in government. Important advances were made in the 2009 administration, but the constraints that we've noted above meant that the structural problems within the political economy were not radically and systematically addressed. Where there was significant massification of programs, like the 17 million social grants reaching some 10 million beneficiaries, and the largest rollout of antiretrovirals in the world, critical gains were achieved. The floor of poverty was lifted, and there have been significant and rapid gains in life expectancy. While these were absolutely essential interventions, they were not inherently transformative. That's the issue we need to face. In other cases, where there were significant budgetary allocations, like in the major state-led infrastructure build program, for instance, much of it had been spent on what, as the SACP, we believe, were non-transformative vanity projects to Shomkul, like the 2010 FIFA World Cup Stadium and other related infrastructure. We are still of the view that includes the Gauteng Freeway Infrastructure Program, the King Shaka International Airport, and the Gautrain. We have not changed our view. But Makura, as Premier, you must know, as the SACP, we are concerned that the Gautrain only goes to former white areas and connects the airport, Sandton, Tshwane. Where is the connection to a Dobsonville? So, to Katlehong, for instance. Now, it's coming. We'll hold you on to that you said it. In the first Zuma-led ANC-led administration, with the establishment of a presidential infrastructure coordinating commission, there was progress in reorienting state-led infrastructure spending into a more coordinated and integrated approach. However, and unfortunately, weaknesses and parasitic activities in key state-owned companies and in different spheres of governments constrained the potential impact. The massive overspending at Nkandla through corrupt means symbolized both the continuation as well as the personalization of the vanity project phenomenon. Siyazi ke thisha omkhulu, unfortunately bakususa usadila nalento yasenkandla. Sakubona izolo ebusuku nika ama-awards e-PSL. Uthe uComrade uNxesi usezoba namathikithi manje njengoba uMinister of Sport. Sifike sizowacela but unfortunately uzobe phetha we-Pirates amaningi. As for social infrastructure, the mass low-cost RDP and other subsidized housing programs have had the unintended consequence of entrenching apartheid spatial patterns by building working-class housing in peripheral locations far from work and other resources. And this has served simply to reproduce working-class marginalization and black poverty. The Gauteng Signature Housing Project, the mixed-income Cosmos City development, was targeted at both subsidized housing for the working class and poor and mortgaged houses for the emergent black professional and other middle strata. However, only a small percentage of the original beneficiaries, owners, are still staying in their houses as a result of the enormous cost of transport because of its location. The subsidized houses are being sold at far below the cost to the state of their construction as the original beneficiaries move out. There are also wide-scale bank repossessions of mortgaged houses in Cosmos City, with auctioning off sales on average fetching 30% less than nominal market value. By the way, the question we need to ask ourselves as the SACP is, are South Africa's urban areas having a housing problem or a cash problem? Why this sale of houses built by government? What is the manifestation of? This demand for more houses, is it really because there is a huge housing crisis or there is an income crisis? Let me put it that way. I think it's a question that deserves to be interrogated. I'm not providing an answer. I'm just merely asking that as a matter of interest. Other potentially critical pillars of a radical second phase of the NDR, like the state-led industrial action program, have simply not received the scale of funding that would enable a qualitative step change. In some cases, the worst ravages of neoliberal-driven deindustrialization and job losses have been halted. And some level of employment stabilization has remarkably been achieved in a sector like clothing and textiles, indicating what could be achieved more widely if there was sufficient political will and resourcing. Public employment programs, while achieving relative massification, are given the extraordinary levels of unemployment nowhere near the scale required and envisaged. By the way, the districts and branches of the SACP needs to come closer to these EPWPs. One day, over the Christmas period, I got about 70 EPWP workers marching to my home, KwaDambuza in Maritzburg. I said, but comrades, why? What have I done now? They say, no, we've been fired. Some of us have been on this EPWP for 5 years. We discover some of them actually were given these EPWP posts so that they could be runners in the ANC KZN conference. Some of them were no longer that helpful. They are being kicked out. Now, that's just one example of the kind of corruption also that is associated with the EPWP. I've forgotten, I'm looking at the former Minister of Public Works, but there's the Deputy Minister of Public Works next to him. We need to be coming close to these things because they can really make a big difference in the lives of our communities. As for land reform, not enough human resources and financial resources. Now, constraining, therefore, serious radical transformation has been the deliberate balancing of forces within Cabinet and the movement, and key departmental and SOC deployment. Throughout the first Zuma-led administration, Treasury remained firmly in the grip of a neoliberal orientation. We agree with Kosatu there. The SACP's partial policy victory at the 2009-2007 Polokwane Conference for the establishment of a state planning organ was watered down into current National Planning Commission, which we think is not as effective as it could have been. It was much more better integrated into state structures. So we note that there have been some advances during the first Zuma administration of a serious kind that we could build on. But post-2014, the picture is changing. State capture then takes off on steroids as the bourgeois democratic tendency degenerates into parasitism. That is the immediate threat that we are facing now. We have seen the dramatic disruption of the pre-existing but always unstable post-Polokwane relative correlation of forces within the ANC and government. And we want to say this as the South African Communist Party, including speaking for myself personally. We feel a betrayal in terms of the understanding we had in Polokwane. That has been betrayed. Our trust has been broken. And we must learn a lesson as the SACP. Unless we root ourselves amongst the people, we can't just freely give trust, which when broken, things go haywire. Personally, Nzimande, that's how I feel. Mhlambe ningibeka icala nami. Nawe Nzimande wathemba kakhulu mfowethu.